Welcome to a brief introduction to the rhetorical appeals, also known as ethos, logos, and pathos. Some of you may have studied this before in a first-year writing class or in high school. Some of you it might be new, but this is kind of a quick introduction to what this rhetorical tool is, and we will practice in the video how to use it essentially. So first of all, Aristotle was an ancient Greek philosopher who came up with this theory of rhetorical appeals. Basically, he argued that in order to make a successful argument or to have successful rhetoric, you have to do three things. You have to appeal to your audience in three different ways: through a logical appeal, an emotional appeal, and an ethical appeal. And we'll talk more about what each one of those is and what it looks like. So first of all, ethos, that's persuading your audience through demonstrating, if you're the person making the argument, demonstrating your credibility as a speaker or writer. Your purpose is to get the audience to trust you. Of course, they're not going to be persuaded by an argument you make if they don't trust you as somebody who's credible on this topic or has done the proper research to become credible. Some of the ways you can establish ethos as a writer or speaker would be to have the education, like a bachelor's or master's or PhD or something in a particular field, or be known as an expert, have expertise in that field. If you don't have those, often just having experience with a particular topic sometimes gives you that credibility. Having status in general or status within that field or that area. Beyond those, the ways in which students typically demonstrate ethos, if they don't have those first things, is just be a credible researcher and a good writer if you're doing this through writing. So do good research and draw from the best and most credible sources, and write well. If you have relatively error-free, thoughtful, coherent, well-written writing, that's a way to demonstrate your authority and your credibility. So Aristotle thought, okay, you could have that, but if you only have that, if you only have credibility, that doesn't mean people are going to be persuaded by your argument. You also have to present a logical and reasonable argument. This is what we think of traditionally as evidence. Your purpose here is to convince your audience that the argument is based on thoughtful, reliable evidence and proof. And of course, we think of providing evidence in multiple ways, but some of the ways we think about it, particularly in writing, is to present facts, research, give proof, give evidence. Evidence and research can come in different forms, of course, but this is where you're really trying to demonstrate to your audience that you've done the research or you know the stuff, and here's the actual evidence why you should believe what you're arguing. And then Aristotle went one step further. It kind of makes sense that you have to demonstrate your credible authority making the argument. You have to give logical reasons for why people should be persuaded. But he also added, you also have to appeal to their emotions. Often people making an argument play on people's fear or anger or distrust or pity or desire. For happiness, things like that. But really, this is the part of the argument where you're trying to pull on people's emotions in order to move them. You're trying to get them to care about the topic and connect with it emotionally. They're more likely to be persuaded if they care about the topic, essentially, and can see its relevance to their lives. Some of the ways in which you can establish pathos, of course, telling stories. People are often very engaged by those, whether they're personal or stories of other people. You can literally insert images or show images if you're giving an argument. Enargia is another ancient Greek term where you describe something in your writing so vividly that the audience can basically picture it in their mind. So the idea there of being very descriptive and bringing images to people's mind can be a way to move them emotionally about your topic. And then, as I said before, you can connect with your audience by making the topic relevant to their lives. So again, Aristotle's theory, the rhetorical appeals, is that you have to appeal to your audience in all three ways, ethos, logos, and pathos, in order to really be a successful rhetor or make a successful rhetorical argument. So you might ask, well, why study rhetoric, or more specifically here, rhetorical appeals? So this comes from a pretty recent book about our culture that discusses in some ways why it's important and relevant. Basically, it's talking about how in this day and age, to be cliche, we live in an age of persuasion. If you look around, there's evidence that we're constantly being inundated with messages trying to persuade us to buy a certain thing, look a certain way, go a certain place, be a certain kind of person. It's just endless. We're surrounded by persuasive messages all the time. And so the argument, of course, would be one of the reasons for studying rhetoric and rhetorical appeals as one tool for studying rhetoric would be that it's a way to help us understand and be more critical of that rhetoric, of those attempts at persuasion that we're being bombarded with, making us less likely to be manipulated by it. We'll be more critical readers of it if we stop and think about the rhetoric and the way they're trying to persuade us. And the other thing, of course, is you use rhetoric and rhetorical appeals as a rhetor yourself, as someone making an argument, and for the purposes of this class, for the most part, in writing. So understanding how rhetoric works and rhetorical tools like the rhetorical appeals, you can put those to use to be more effective rhetors yourself. You can make more effective arguments if you know different kinds of tools to use, and rhetorical appeals is one of them. So I thought I'd share a quick example here, the kind of thing I would bring into class if we were doing a face-to-face class, and we'd analyze it as a class. So this is a real-world example of a piece of rhetoric. It's from 2007. It's probably hard to remember a time in our lives when iPhones did not exist, but prior to 2007, they did not. And so in 2007, they introduced the iPhone. The first people who bought the iPhone paid $599 for it. 2 months later, they dropped the price by $200 to $399, which of course angered the customers who had already bought it and jumped on the bandwagon right away. So Steve Jobs was the CEO of Apple at the time, very well known. So he was inundated with, what he says here, hundreds of emails from customers that were irate but they paid more right away. And so this letter, which was distributed on the Apple website, but of course intended for their iPhone customers, as it says, to all iPhone customers, as a way of trying to persuade, so it's a piece of rhetoric, persuade customers that the company ultimately stands by its decision, but that they still want to address the concerns, anger, and frustration of those who bought the iPhones already. It's read as kind of an apology to the customers, but it's certainly a response to their anger and frustration. So that's the context and purpose of this piece of rhetoric. So now we can look at it through the rhetorical appeals lens and ask ourselves, how does Steve Jobs, try to appeal to customers through ethos by demonstrating credibility? So one quick way, at the end, you can't see it, didn't print on this first page here, but the only thing missing from this document is his signature, which said Steve Jobs, Apple CEO. So of course, even just naming himself as the CEO of a company gives him status and credibility, of course. So some of the language that he uses in paragraph 1, he says, after reading every one of these emails that we received. So he's demonstrating credibility by saying, look, I actually read your emails. Paragraph 2, he says, first, I'm sure that we're making the correct decision. So that's him establishing credibility by saying, I'm confident in my decision. I know we did the right thing. So he's standing by it. In paragraph 3, he demonstrates credibility by very smartly drawing upon the fact that he's worked in technology for 30 plus years. So he just basically says that. So people, again, are more likely to be persuaded by your argument if they can tell you're a credible source. And he's drawing on his 30 plus years of experience. In paragraph 4, again, we get that confidence. We're making the right decision. He's standing by it. In paragraph 6, he says we want to do the right thing. That sounds like a credible person, right? Or a credible company, a company that wants to do the right thing. And then lastly, as I had talked about, just writing well, having strong writing that's well organized, as this is, flows well, easy to follow, easy to understand, no grammatical errors. That reflects on your credibility as an author as well. You may see other ways he demonstrated ethos, but those are some of the things that jump out to me as seeing how he used his credibility or demonstrated his credibility in order to persuade his readers of his argument. So how does he use logos? There's less of that in this letter, at least as I see it. But he does, of course, logos again is providing logical, reasonable evidence, essentially. So in paragraph 1, he says, I have observations and conclusions. That's setting it up for, I'm actually going to give some logical observations and conclusions. Paragraph 2, he demonstrates logos or uses logos by justifying the price drop, explaining why they did it. In paragraph 3, again, we've got that discussion of technology with the statement specifically, if you always wait for the next price cut or to buy the new improved model, you'll never buy any technology product. That's probably at its core his logical argument. Look, this happens in technology. If you want to wait, you're going to spend less money, but you're not going to have the newest model of something, and everything just keeps changing so quickly. So you just have to accept that that's a part of buying technology. So how does he appeal to his customers through pathos, or does he? And there are certainly some attempts, I think. So again, you might find other evidence in here, but what I see, paragraph 1, after reading every one of these emails, again, I think that's demonstrating ethos, but also appealing to his readers' emotions. I care. I read your emails. In paragraph 2, he talks about the idea of making the phone more affordable to customers. That sounds like a nice company, doesn't it? Makes them sound nice. That's appealing to our emotions. Paragraph 4, he says we need to do a better job taking care of our early iPhone customers. Certainly, that's patting the reader, the audience on the back, making them feel good. And then paragraph 5 is where we actually get some concrete, okay, we're going to offer you store credit. That certainly feels like an emotional appeal. And then in paragraph 6 is where we get the apology and the sentiment essentially of wanting to live up to the customer's high expectations. So ultimately, when you use ethos, logos, and pathos, or the rhetorical appeals, as a way or a tool to analyze a piece of rhetoric, then ultimately you ask yourself, after kind of listing those things like I just did, based on how he employed ethos, logos, and pathos, is this ultimately an effective piece of rhetoric? Did he do it well? Does he make a good argument, and is it persuasive? And of course, that would depend on the audience for sure. But once you list those things out, I feel like when I've taught this in class, most students have agreed that it's an effective piece of rhetoric. He does employ ethos, logos, and pathos in a way that would likely have persuaded his audience in 2007. I have had students, though, say that if it were them, if they were the reader, of course that's, 12 years later or so, that they would not necessarily have been persuaded. And it was mostly because of the pathos appeal, feeling like he sounded maybe cocky, too overconfident. He didn't, by not calling it a mistake, that would have turned them off, and that it doesn't feel like a real apology. So some people, I think, would have felt like for them it wouldn't have been an effective piece of rhetoric, but mostly based on that pathos appeal, feeling like, is that really genuine? Kind of a genuine appeal to the reader's emotions. And then another question you ask after doing an analysis like this is, how does analyzing the author's use of rhetorical appeals help us understand and or receive his rhetoric? Again, the idea is that by understanding rhetoric and employing rhetorical tools like the rhetorical appeals, ethos, logos, pathos, is that it helps you become a more critical reader of that rhetoric. So maybe you wouldn't be manipulated by it or see yourself as being manipulated by it, but that you could, pick it apart a little bit and say, okay, so is he doing what he should be doing? Is this, is there a logical argument in there? Or is he essentially manipulating his readers? So it gives you one tool, and we'll work with others this semester, essentially other ways to use rhetoric to be more critical readers of other people's rhetoric. But that's the introduction to ethos, logos, pathos.